formal briefing. Welcome to American Community Media's Friday National Online News Briefing. I'm Sandy Close, your moderator for today. On the cusp of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, today's briefing explores the effort by the Trump administration to retell the history of America as a whites-only drama with no significant non-white participation, and the push to reclaim community narratives, often against formidable odds. It's a push we are witnessing not only on the streets of Minneapolis, but in efforts to resist an escalating series of executive orders to cancel exhibits at national museums, rename national parks, censor school curricula, and I could go on. The inspiration for today's briefing was a fascinating all-day conference held at the Japanese American National Museum last Friday called Echoes of History, which I attended and where I heard two of the people who will be speaking to us today. What struck me at the conference was how the role of ethnic media in documenting the intimate life of their communities is more urgent than ever. Before introducing our speakers, I want to share a quote from George Orwell I read in a report by the Center for American Progress last fall on the high stakes in who tells America's story. Quote, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." Our speakers include Anne Burroughs, President and CEO of the Japanese American Natural Museum and Board Chair of Amnesty International. Ms. Burroughs opened last week's conference. Margaret Huang, Senior Fellow at the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights and former President and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who also spoke last Friday. Ray Suarez, veteran journalist with PBS, who is currently hosting the new PBS TV series Wisdom Keepers, and whose latest book is We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. And Anneshia Hardy, founding executive director of Alabama Values and a cultural narrative strategist who works to advance community engagement and narrative power across the South. Today's briefing is the first in an ongoing series on who gets to tell the history of America. Our next briefing in March will focus on Native Americans. We will share extended bios, contact information for each of our speakers, and a recording of today's briefing later this afternoon. On Monday, we will send our own report and video excerpts, which we hope you will consider sharing on your websites and social media posts. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat, and speakers, please speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. Now we begin with Ms. Anne Burroughs, who will share an overview about the struggle over who gets to tell the American story and the importance of museums like JANM in documenting community narratives. Ms. Burroughs, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy. It's really wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And, you know, what a privilege to be with icons like Ray and Margaret and Anneshia. I, of course, I'm pleased to meet you, and I've heard so much about you. And, you know, Sandy, you've been such a constant in the progressive media field for such a long time. So, and also I really feel so honored to be with all of you. And it's extraordinary just to see the number of people who've joined us. Because, for me, like ethnic museums, like my museum, that I happen to be the CEO of, the Japanese American National Museum, the ethnic media has really you've been at the forefront of documenting community stories that might otherwise be ignored, distorted, or just simply erased, and it's been because of you that the lived experiences of people of communities of color across our nation have been documented, that their truths have been reported and their stories have been told. And you've also been so unbelievably instrumental in ensuring that communities see themselves reflected with dignity and with accuracy. And we know that that is something that the mainstream media has absolutely failed to do. So I do think that there are a lot of parallels between the work that ethnic museums do and the work that you do, that we do, in a sense, the same work. We're holders of memory, we resist erasure, and we always insist on telling the truth, and we insist on telling the truth fully. And as we approach, well, we're not approaching, we're in the 250th, the year of the 250th anniversary of the United States. And I think that it really requires all of us to ask a very fundamental question. Who gets to decide what this country remembers? And who gets to decide what it forgets or what it erases? So we also know that anniversaries are not neutral, because it's the anniversaries where we come together to remember. It's the anniversaries that shape memory. And they also fundamentally influence what is taught, what is funded, and how future generations come to believe about who belongs in this nation and on what terms. So this year, of course, it becomes especially urgent because the Trump administration has made concerted efforts to present a very narrowed, sanitized version of American history that's tied to the 250th anniversary, one that minimizes conflict, that attempts to erase history, homogenize culture, erase diversity, one that entirely avoids accountability and always seems to be framing the past through a single ideological lens. And of course, we know that that is not American history. One of the extraordinary things about this country, and it's one of the reasons why I chose, finally, after a very long time, to become a citizen of this country, a naturalized citizen of this country, is because of the extraordinary diversity. And it's that diversity of opinion, of ethnicity, of geography, of history, of memory that makes us so strong and so powerful, and that is worth celebrating. And that, as well as, the ideals and the Constitution, although we know that there are many flaws in those. But for me, it's not just a simple cultural debate. It really is, at the end of the day, a struggle about power. So we always know that authoritarian regimes, whether here in the US or whether the world over, that they consistently attack culture and history first. And they also attack memory. And, for us, for museums, since the beginning of 2025, we've, like everybody else, had to exist and try and keep our doors open and be true to our communities in a climate of very deliberate destabilization. We've faced incredible pressures as museums to alter interpretation, avoid histories, conform to political expectations. And we've also been further weaponized by having our funding threatened or disruptive. And also, in all of this, civic space is shrunk. And of course, when civic space is shrunk, one of the first things that goes is our First Amendment rights. And I believe firmly that museums operate within that realm of First Amendment rights. So the attacks on us are really just, and the attacks on you and the attacks on truth are really just part of that narrowing. And I think that all museums are seeing that. Certainly for cultural history museums, it's very, very present, because our work rests on holding histories that are inconvenient, those inconvenient truths, the histories of exclusion, resistance, survival, struggle. And those are the histories that are being erased, that are being flattened, that are being homogenized now. And of course, for us at the Japanese American National Museum, it's not an existential, it's real, because we were founded, we exist to ensure that the history of the incarceration of Japanese Americans is never forgotten, but also importantly, that it never happens to anybody else. So that's very, very much part of our DNA. In 1942, over 125,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes. They were imprisoned without due process. Communities was destroyed. They were dispossessed, and essentially had to rebuild themselves. So certainly for the Japanese American community and, our community of the museum at large, and for communities of color across the country, certainly our communities know what it means when racism is legalized, when constitutional rights are suspended, and when propaganda displaces truth. And of course, what we're seeing today are just the incredible echoes of that history. And it's played out so unbelievably, tragically, and powerfully over the last year. And of course, the events in Minnesota most recently. I mean, we've noted, for quite some time now, the terror stalking our streets across the country, the kidnappings, the disappearances, the incarceration, the deportations, and then, just most recently, the tragic murders, the executions of Alec Petty and Renee Good. And then we just saw, in the last 24 hours, the arrest of Don Lemon, an independent journalist. So for us as museums, and I know that it's true for ethnic media as well, we are part of the civic fabric of our country, and we can never be neutral. We can never be neutral, because it's the museums, it's the communities, it's you as the tellers and the keepers of the story who actually ensure that influence, those voices are not erased, they remain visible, but also very, very importantly, ensuring that memory is passive. And for us at the museum, memory can never be passive. And we know unequivocally that memory really at the end of the day is about power, because it's about preserving memory is not about nostalgia. It's about who gets to define the past and who has the power to shape the future. And for us at JANM, we were the first museum within 2 weeks of the inauguration last year to speak up, and to speak up very, very powerfully. Our trustees came out with a statement in the middle of February of last year in defense of history, democracy, and civil rights, because it was so apparent, and of course we've seen this play out, it was so apparent that the same laws, the same discriminatory laws that we use to jail and incarcerate their parents and their grandparents were being used again. The same laws to exclude them were being used again. So for our trustees, it was an act of defiance, but it was also an act of defense of their family legacies, but also of memory. But we were the first museum to stand up, and for almost 2 months, we were the only museum, and we've consistently stuck with those positions. But not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's because in 1942, nobody stood up for Japanese Americans, and we feel an incredible obligation now to be able to stand up for our sister museums that don't have the same kind of luxury that we do, to be able to speak out, and also to be able to be there with communities of color. So it's also as much an act of solidarity as it is anything else. So, final remarks, Sandy, I'm sorry I'm going on. As we approach the 250th anniversary, that question really comes down is, whether US ideals are worth honoring. And of course they are. They're worth honoring, they're worth celebrating. But it needs to be the history, the real history. It needs to be the full history and the truthful history. So thank you. And I'm sorry if I went over.
Sandy, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry. We have time, and honestly, don't apologize. What you said was just inspiring. And we have time for two very quick questions, which I'm going to ask first. Carlos Roa, could you ask your question?
Cool. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, Japanese Americans have shown how the collective action can preserve history. So, what advice could you give to us, the Latino community, trying to protect and tell our own story as we are facing political hostility today?
You know, one of the most powerful ways, I think, and you know, I'm not an expert on this, but I think one of the most powerful things that you can do is to be sure that you and all of us are documenting on a daily basis what's happening now. Because, you know, this is the history that future generations going to remember, and this is the history that's going to define this generation. So it's really, really important that we never forget what those echoes of history are and how powerfully they inform the present. And, you know, I would say it's documenting those histories. You know, the Latino community is obviously very diverse, and each community has its own history and its own way of telling its history. But it's really, really important that we keep those lessons and we use them to influence the present and to shape the future.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to read a question from Nestor Fantini because of time. Does the museum include the story of Ralph Lazo, the Mexican-American who voluntarily joined the Japanese-American prisoners to the concentration camps in 1942, a great symbol of the links between two oppressed racial communities?
So, you know, we're actually closed for renovation at the moment, apart from, you know, our office has been closed today in solidarity with Minnesota. But we're in the process of redoing our new permanent exhibition. And I can't tell you definitively whether Ralph's story will be included, but I can tell you it's a very much a revered story. And we have done any number of, oh, Cheryl just reminded me, Ralph's story is in our new permanent exhibition. And of course, we've done stories, we've done documentaries about, you know, his extraordinary contribution and sacrifice and, you know, act of solidarity.
Great. Thank you. We have many more questions. Please look on the chat box. And our next speaker is Margaret Huang, who will discuss from her years of experience running the Southern Poverty Law Center and now as a fellow with Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, how the struggle to define history has unfolded in the South and untold stories of people living in fear while still demanding to claim their own narratives. Margaret, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much, Sandy, for having me and for the opportunity to continue this great conversation. It was a real pleasure to be at JANM last week. And I'm so delighted that Ray and Anneshia are with us as well. Particularly Anneshia is going to probably have a lot more to say about some of the things I'll be talking about. That's really her expertise. But I'm happy to be part of this conversation and so anxious that we really think about challenging the community narratives, the official narratives that are coming out of this administration. Many of you will know the history of the Confederate loss in the South, but depending on where you grew up, you might know a different version. Where I grew up in East Tennessee, we never talked about the Reconstruction era. We never talked about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. We never learned about the civil rights movement. My American history class focused on the number of people killed in various battles over the course of US history, and that was about it. And it wasn't until I arrived in Washington, D.C. to go to college that I actually first learned about Japanese American internment at the Smithsonian Museum for American History. And I was so stunned that this was part of US history that I had never learned. And it of course made me immediately wonder, well, what else don't I know? And that, of course, has led me to a lifetime of commitment to challenging false narratives and the unwillingness of so many people to actually deal with the real history, to acknowledge the incredible stories of so many folks in our country who continue to capture their own narratives but don't get an official platform. Over the last several years, we've actually seen a challenge to some of that. Some of you may know the Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked Confederate memorials around the country for many years now. And in fact, we put out our first report, I think about 7 years ago now in 2018. And what we learned is that there are Confederate memorials in nearly every state in the country, which is a bit surprising because the Confederate War was not fought outside of the South and the East Coast states. But there are memorials to Confederate generals and other high leaders of the Confederacy all across the country. Streets named, schools named, statues built in the strangest of places. And that's really a reflection of why that history was documented. None of these memorials were put into place right after the war. These memorials were put into place 60, 80 years later when the narrative of white supremacy was very much at the forefront, particularly in fighting back against the civil rights movement. So as community organizers across the South and in other parts of the country started to demand Jim Crow laws be overturned, that segregation be ended, we started to see the spread of Confederate memorials and the recognition of people who have never been heroes to this country. In the last few years, since 2015, we've actually seen a number of these memorials taken down. But today there are still more than 2,000 memorials all across the country that praise and lift up people who were actually traitors to the US. And it's worth asking why this administration has chosen to join that effort. Many of you will know that the US military decided to rename the 9 bases that were named after Confederate generals. They organized a panel of experts, they consulted with communities, they looked and combed through the history of the military, and they found some extraordinary heroes to recognize, people who really reflect the beautiful diversity of this country. And now this administration has decided to revert back to people who actually fought against our country. So as we're thinking about this narrative and why this administration is choosing to emphasize a history that eliminates and erases so many of us from our past, I want to share with you that some of the best efforts to counter this are happening at the community level. And many of you who cover local news and who work with community organizations know this. We've seen, particularly in Montgomery, where the Southern Poverty Law Center is based, some of the most incredible challenges to this public narrative. Of course, many of you will know Brian Stevenson's efforts at the Equal Justice Initiative, his Legacy Museum, the Museum to the Lynching Victims. But there's one other story that I wanted to share with you today, and that's the story of the Mothers of Gynecology. Many of you may know the incredible activist Michelle Browder, who is also a spectacular artist. And beginning in college and school, she learned about the story of the Mothers of Gynecology and fought to get recognition for them. So the backstory of this is that a man named J. Marion Sims started operating without anesthesia on enslaved women in Montgomery, Alabama, to develop the practice that is currently today still used in obstetrics and gynecology. He developed the tools of this practice, he developed the procedures and surgeries of this practice, and he did so by abusing women, enslaved women, whom he specifically chose because of their inability to reject or demand that they not be included in his efforts. He then later moved to New York City, where he opened the first hospital for women. And some of you may know that New York actually successfully petitioned to take down the statue to him in the New York City Central Park. But in Montgomery, there is still a statue to J. Marion Sims sitting on the front lawn of the state house, the state legislature. So to enter the state legislature, you actually have to walk by the statue of J. Marion Sims. Michelle Browder has fought to take that statue down for the last few decades. And during COVID, when she was unsuccessful at getting the state legislators to consider her petition, she decided to make a memorial to 3 of the enslaved women who were operated on by J. Marion Sims. Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy were those 3 women. And she has a beautiful memorial to those 3 women that is welded out of metals, including the tools of gynecology. And she has built this incredible memorial to tell the story, to tell the community story. And what's amazing about Michelle's work is she doesn't just talk about the history, she draws connections to today. If you look at the state of Alabama today, 44 counties offer no obstetric or gynecological care at all. So Michelle is using proceeds from visitors to her memorial to fund a bus that travels around the state of Alabama and provides midwifery and doulas and other gynecological care to women across the state. And it's a way of lifting up the challenges to women's reproductive health care in Alabama, while also making sure we don't forget the incredible sacrifices and contributions of the women who enabled that practice to develop. Delighted to take your questions, and thank you, Sandy, for having me here.
Thank you for that. And I think we have time for one question, very challenging question. Henrietta Burroughs, will you ask your question?
Thanks so much, Sandy. Some parents, white parents, say they don't want their children exposed to the history of the U.S. because they would feel guilty. So how can we honestly present that history so that it doesn't seem like it's blaming others for committing the atrocities that have been committed?
Thank you, Henrietta. You know, I'm pretty sure that there is no one alive today who participated in the practice of slavery. So it is a strange argument to make that somebody would feel guilty. If that's so, if you're feeling guilty because perhaps your ancestor did participate, I don't think that's a bad thing. I feel guilty all the time about American presence in so many parts of the world and the role that the Americans have played all over the place. That doesn't prevent me from trying to make our country better and from trying to protect human rights here at home and internationally. Guilt is inherently part of learning. When you learn about history, whether it's yours or someone else's, it makes you question appropriately how we could do a better job. And I think that people who are afraid of feeling guilty or afraid of their children feeling badly about the practice of slavery are focusing on the wrong questions. That may not help you in your answer, but I do think that it's important that we not turn away from our history, because there are equally incredible stories of how Americans have overcome these wrongs, how we overturned slavery, how we are still today fighting for equity and equality in this country. And we can't tell those stories if we don't acknowledge the harm that was done to begin with. Thanks.
Thank you for eloquent answer. Excellent question, eloquent answer. We go now to our third speaker, veteran journalist and broadcaster and author whose new book I want to mention again, because honestly, that's one thing we can do to recognize the great value of the time our speakers give us. Ray's new book is We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. Ray will talk about the administration's efforts to re-engineer the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and what that could mean or does mean for the health, especially of Latinos, who make up 1/5 of the country's population. Thank you, Ray Suarez.
Well, thanks. Great to be with you. Nice to be invited. And it's such a great time to be having this conversation because we're watching the national government using its muscle, its funding power, its tremendous ability to influence all parts of our common life to attempt to, in effect, revoke or repeal the last 50 years of reconsidering what American history really is and who gets to tell it and who gets included. And almost in the sense of the last kick of a dying mule, give white grievance a chance to be aired, a chance to be heard, a chance to use demographic muscle to impose a fantasy narrative on the United States as it considers its 250 years of existence. Whether you want to talk about the Revolutionary War itself, which was a war fought by Englishmen, certainly, but also Dutchmen and Scots and Irish and Black people from born in the United States or what would become the United States and born in Africa. Native Americans from all the way up by the border, which would become the dividing line between the United States and Canada, clear down to the Gulf of America. And I just can't imagine the kind of effort that's going into reaching those tendrils into so many parts of our lives, whether it's a curricula for elementary school students, whether it's the display placards and illuminative expository texts that are at national monuments. Recently, the history of slavery at a presidential site, a president who owned slaves was removed by National Park Service employees because Donald Trump believes that too much of the national retelling of our history involves, in his words, slavery was bad. Well, yeah, it was bad. And it really is a big part of our past as a country and what became our shared country, because after manumission, after the widespread freedom of the 4 million people held in bondage in the American South, the revolution had to go on for another 100 years against the bondage, the forms of bondage, economic and social, that remained in place for the century following. This idea that it makes white people feel bad, or it makes white children feel guilty, or all this other frabba-jabba, it's baloney. This is all a power play. It's a power play to reassert the centrality, the almost sharing of the center spotlight on the stage of American history of just one kind of people. And really, what are these people? In order to enter into this realm of that story, you have to share a fantasy that everybody between Cork in Ireland and Krakow in Poland are somehow the same kind of people. But at the same time, people in Andalusia in southern Spain and people in Ceuta and Melilla and Casablanca just across the Straits of Gibraltar, a day's ferry ride away, are not the same people. So this idea of whiteness, which is a contrived, engineered, historical idea, is becoming so powerfully asserted in the discourse now. As just today, I was watching some flame war online. Someone was highlighting an exhibition on soldiers in the Second World War, and there was an exhausted GI in a helmet with a rifle, but he was a black guy, and people went berserk, logging in to say, well, you know, they weren't really combat troops and they didn't really fight that much and they really didn't die that much, because the idea that there is no shared national sense that we're all in this, that everybody sort of pitched in to win the Second World War, is so strong right now. And the young men marching around a statue of Robert E. Lee at the Unite the Right rally, chanting, "You will not replace us." I think in some ways that's the central text of this moment. This fear, this anxiety that being able to dictate who is American, being a gatekeeper to say, yes, this person is one of us and this person isn't. This resurgence, this invention of this new idea, legacy Americans. I don't know how many of you have heard this term recently, legacy Americans, frequently used by Tucker Carlson, by Nick Fuentes, and many others, heritage Americans. And what they mean is a really sort of squiggly concept, because 75 million people came from Europe between roughly 1845 and 1924, when the door was slammed shut. Are they all part of that story? Are people who were speaking Yiddish and Russian and Romanian and Sicilian dialect and English and Dutch, are they all part of that story? Well, it's better if you don't ask that question, because this whole idea doesn't stand up to much interrogation. But that idea, heritage Americans, if you've been here for a couple of generations, your Americanness is more valid, more real. Your story is more notable and honorable than mine, than many others whose families have come here since after the Second World War. That is really a vile kind of idea, but one that's enjoying great currency right now. This is the white lash. We're in the middle of it, with the government trying to dictate architectural styles, with congressional committees trying to figure out whose story really matters as we put together these 250th anniversary celebrations. It's a weird time, and we just have to keep hold of the facts, keep hold of what's real. Remember General Galvez fighting in the American South and along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico as part of the American Revolution. And remember that America has been multicultural since day one. It always has been. It always will be. It's not just a story of white people between Moscow and Dublin. And
Thank
we
you,
could
Ray.
keep that in mind, we'll be all right.
Thank you. That was such an eloquent underscoring that at the root of this, we're talking about power. And one of the things you said when we first talked about how the effort to erase Latino history, for example, has a direct relevance to the health of a fifth of the population. So here comes your one question, which we're so limited on time, but reflects that from Brianna Mendez Padilla. Please ask on my behalf, how does the erasure of Latino and immigrant history shape how the public understands immigration today? You could
Great
say,
question,
read my book.
because Latino history is American history, and American history is Latino history. And the idea that we're just Johnny-come-latelys to the American story is one that's very convenient for this project of creating this new white centrality to the American story, but it's ahistorical. If you think that American history begins with off-course, grumpy Protestants landing in Massachusetts, you will tell one kind of American story. If you think of this as a canvas on which three empires fought a multi-century shoving match that was an extension of the battles that they were having back home in Europe on somebody else's land for a couple of centuries. You think of American history as a different thing. Whether it's St. Augustine, Florida, or Santa Fe, there were really, really old Spanish-speaking cities in North America long before Jamestown and long before Plymouth Rock. And that history is our history.
Thank you. Please, all of our first three speakers will look forward to coming back with a final round of questions. I now want to welcome our fourth speaker, Anneshia Hardy, who will share her perspective on her career helping communities and movements strengthen their narrative power across the South, and especially in Alabama, where there is not a single public museum that documents the history of slavery in that state, which is something I learned listening to Margaret last Friday. Thank you, Anneshia, so much for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I actually was spending a lot of time in the chat, and I was like, I need to get out of the chat. I want to answer all the questions. But I mean, you know, as the United States commemorates the 250th anniversary, we're being asked very deliberately to celebrate a story that is increasingly narrow, that has been carefully curated, and is incomplete. I think we all can agree there. And I think this moment isn't just about commemoration, it's political. And it's also unfolding at a time when many communities are being told to show up for a democracy that is simultaneously working to erase their histories, to silence their voices, their truth, and also the collective memory. So I want to be honest here about the tension, because people feel it. And so the question isn't whether America will tell a story about itself, because, you know, or accurate story about itself, because it is always telling a story, right? But the real question is, whose lives, whose, you know, labor, whose resistance, whose voices are going to be allowed to shape that story, and who, you know, is treated as inconvenient, divisive, or disposable. And so across the country, and especially across the US South, and also in my state, you know, we're watching a coordinated effort to control historical meaning. You know, we're seeing national museums being pressured to cancel or sanitize, you know, their exhibits. We're seeing the school curriculum being restricted in the name of neutrality, or limiting what is being called divisive concepts. And none of this is you know, is unusually described as erasure. Instead, it is being framed as, oh, this is common sense. Oh, this is patriotism. Or this is us returning to our shared, you know, values as a country. But let's call it what it is. You know, in practice, this is narrative governance. It is an attempt to reassert a version of America that is white-centered, that is orderly, that is unbothered by the violence and exclusion that even made this nation possible. And, you know, this isn't new. Like Anne mentioned during her comments, that the control over history has always been a tool of power. You know, what's different now is the urgency of it, the way these efforts are accelerating at the exact moment when we're seeing, you know, demographic changes, cultural shifts, we're, you know, and seeing grassroots organizing, you know, have made it harder to maintain the lie or the fiction of this uncontested American past. You know, and I also love the point that, you know, you pointed out that narrative erasure is often treated like this cultural disagreement, but in fact, it is structural. You know, it is connected to cultural memory. And when communities are pushed out of this nation's official memory, it becomes easier to push them out of the nation's protections, out of the resources, out of the political imagination. And I see this clearly in Alabama, where much of my work is rooted, you know, as you mentioned, you know, Sandy, there isn't a single like state funded like museum dedicated to documenting the full history of slavery, right? People are often surprised when they hear that. like you were. But that absence tells us a lot. It reflects a long-standing refusal to publicly reckon with how wealth, how power, and political authority was actually built. And, you know, a lot of the current debate about history stays stuck at the messaging level. Like, what language can we say? What words can we use? But I am concerned about the narrative erasure, because narrative shapes what people, you know, believe, what feels, you know, what they feel is possible. And at Alabama Values, you know, we are approaching the commemoration of, you know, America's 250th with a clear understanding that people are not just struggling with facts. They are struggling with meaning. So across our work, we see communities grappling with overlapping political realities, you know, escalating anti-immigrant attacks, the normalization of white nationalism, white nationalist rhetoric, persistence of anti-Blackness, the censorship of history and education, you know, state violence, both visible and quietly bureaucratic. And so in moments like this, simply providing information is not enough. People are asking deeper questions about belonging, about power, about whether democracy has room, you know, for us all. And this is why, you know, our work is rooted in meaning making, because meaning making really helps communities connect the past to the present. It helps, you know, communities understand how power is operating now. And so as we head towards the 250th, one of the ways, you know, we are doing this is through our project, This is America, which is a long-term narrative initiative that brings together historians, political scientists, community storytellers, journalists, and cultural workers. The goal is not to produce a single sanitized story of the nation. It is to tell the full story, honestly, rigorously, you know, in community, and to really help people situate their lived experiences within the broader historical and political context. And so, you know, This is America creates a space for the various lenses and voices that are often siloed for them to work together. The historians, you know, will help ground us in what has been deliberately forgotten. The political scientists are going to, you know, just really illuminate how structures of power adapt and endure. And then, of course, our community storytellers and journalists, they can translate that, you know, those realities into language that resonates with folks. I do want to point out that, you know, the This is America project is deeply connected to our Southern Narrative Project, which is a regional storytelling and narrative research initiative that we launched in partnership with Sony Films to really help the South, you know, tell it the truth. You know, through the Southern Narrative Project, we work with artists, researchers, organizers, cultural workers to really surface stories that are often distorted in our, you know, in our region. And so the project intentionally, you know, is intentionally interdisciplinary and Southern led, and just really grounded in the belief that the South does not need to borrow narratives from elsewhere to be worthy. Instead, it needs space and resources and trust to really name the realities that folks are living in. And the reason that I'm focusing on the South is because the South is often described as an outlier in conversations about democracy. You know, a place where backlash and historical, you know, denial is just expected, right? But that framing lets the rest of the country off the hook. The truth is, the South isn't peripheral to American democracy. It is central to it. This region has long been a testing ground for the policies that we're seeing, the exclusionary policies that we're seeing today. And at the same time, it's been a proving ground, right? Where, you know, we've seen movements that have expanded the democratic possibility. I know Margaret mentioned learning about Reconstruction and how that changed her thinking, right? So from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement to today's voting rights, you know, cases, the struggles in the South have repeatedly reshaped national law and public understanding, and oftentimes at the tremendous cost of the people that's leading, you know, them. And I do want to, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I know you said we're running short on time, Sandy, but I do want to highlight, okay. And I do want to highlight that, you know, American community media hosting this conversation today is an example of how the media should be approaching this issue. When national institutions retreat from the historical truth, you know, community and ethnic media and grassroots communications organizations like Alabama Values, you know, often become the place where memory is held and protected. And so these outlets do more than report headlines. They really document the everyday life that communities are going through. And so I think in this political moment, we're seeing this type of erasure and censorship, community media becomes even more essential. And I want to close by saying that the whitewashing, of history is not a passive act, that it is an active political strategy, one that serves white supremacy by narrowing who is seen as fully American and whose suffering and resistance and humanity, can be safely ignored. And so, this kind of narrative distortion doesn't just misinform, it divides us. And so authoritarian and fascist movements, they really thrive in this type of narrative, terrain. And so as we approach the 250th, the question isn't whether America will tell a story, about itself. It will, but the question is whether that story will be expansive enough to really hold the truth and the conflict and the accountability, or whether it would just retreat into, the myth making that demands, silence from those who, complicate it.
Thank you so much for your eloquent presentation, Anneshia. There are so many wonderful questions. I'm having a hard time selecting which one to ask first, but let me go to Nancy Tran with Vietnamese Radio in Northern California. Nancy, do you want to ask your question?
Is this for all panelists? I know you said we were.
It is really for you and then any other panelist who wants to jump in. Nancy. And if Nancy's having trouble getting on the call, I can say that her question raises the impact of social media and false information, fake news on the telling, on the telling of the history of America, the confusion over social media. Anneshia, how do you see social media as both a positive and a negative in the work you do to help communities claim their narratives? You're unmuted.
No. So social media and disinformation, I will say, have radically reshaped how America's history is told, and often, as I put it, distorted. Because platforms, reward speed, they reward outrage, clickbait, simplicity, all of this, which makes complex history easy to flatten into memes, into talking points, into conspiracy theories. And so disinformation really thrives in that environment by offering, we see it, the emotionally charged, ahistorical narratives that feel true, even when they aren't, right? And over time, repetition replaces evidence and the myth starts to look like facts. And so, this dynamic also weakens the trust in, shared sources of knowledge. And so when people are no longer, when people no longer agree on what's real, history becomes a battleground instead of a reference point. And that opens the door for extremists and authoritarian narratives to really take hold, especially those that rely on, I think, Anne, you pointed out nostalgia, or fear or selective memory. But at the same time, social media can be a tool for reclamation, allowing communities to tell their own story, their own histories directly. But, without context or media literacy and accountability, disinformation often travels faster than the truth. And so we're even playing around with influencers, storytellers, citizen journalists to combat some of the negative narratives or false narratives or myths that are out there. And that is part of our This is America project. But thank you for that question.
Great. Okay. And now we open it up for one last question. But I do urge our speakers to look through the chat for any follow-up communication, because we so rarely get a chance to ask questions of people with expertise in this field. And I want to go to this very important question, which is really geared to all of our ethnic media. as citizens, what actions can be taken to maintain the unity and identity of communities? Is there a key message? That's a question from Sandra Martinez. And then a related question is, what do you advise our media to do to most ensure that the histories of our communities become visible? And what happens when they are invisible if we can't uplift our stories through national museums like the Smithsonian? How do we reach a wider public? Let's ask each of our speakers to address any part of that question, or perhaps share your final thoughts. And let me go first to Anne Burroughs, our first speaker.
Thank you, Sandy. I'll just very briefly answer, I think, the question about, how do communities resist erasure? And I think that it goes back to 2 points that I made that I'd, like to reinforce. The one is that I think that the role that all of you play as being ethnic media is just unbelievably important, because it's you who are, documenting the stories and the memories and the experiences. And it's your work that the communities will remember. It may not be the work, so it is your work that the communities will remember. And the last thing I would say too, and I think it goes back to a point I made, and it's been reinforced by all of our speakers, is that preserving memory, whatever that means, whether it's the storytelling, whether it's the artifacts, whether it's the history, it's fundamentally about who gets to define the past. It's fundamentally about power and who gets to shape the future. And I think the power of that really lies with us. And history, in some senses, for a while may remember the Trump administration and what they've done. But at the end of the day, for me, it's the human stories. It's the human stories that will be remembered. And we now have the tools to remember those stories that we didn't have before.
That's a wonderful answer. Let's go next to Margaret Huang. And Margaret, I mentioned to you going to the Memphis Civil Rights Museum and being overcome by the incredible exhibit of Black media documenting the lived experience throughout the civil rights movement. The entire museum had dedicated a big, I would say half of the museum, to showcasing how Black media covered on a daily and weekly basis the stories of the civil rights movement. It was a really powerful example of just what Anne has talked about.
I remember that. Thanks for sharing it, Sandy. One of the greatest tools of authoritarian regimes is to make people in that society so fearful that they won't stand up and fight back. One of the things that I read recently is that under the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazi regime in Germany, 90% of Germans were bystanders, did nothing, didn't fight the efforts of the Nazi regime, but also didn't stand up or help anybody else. And that was such a tool used by that regime to actually succeed in oppressing people in that society. What's most important right now, particularly for people like all of you who are telling the stories and doing the hard work of making sure that narratives are not buried in our communities, is giving inspiration. When you tell a story like Sandy just did about the incredible impact of Black journalists during the fight for civil rights, it not only reminds people about our history, but it gives them reason to be hopeful. It gives them a vision of how we get through this terrible moment and how we will tell our stories on the other side. And so right now, the purpose for all of us is to be giving people a reason to fight back, to reject the narrative, to reject this administration's policies, and to work together to create a narrative about how this country really should be a reflection of all of our communities, not just the one narrative that's being promoted right now. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you. And Mr. Ray Suarez, your thoughts. And believe me, I'm going to go out and buy your book this afternoon.
Well, we are right now at a level of foreign-born population in the United States that we haven't seen since the 1910 census. So just over a century to reach this new peak. And it was a very, very controversial idea then. And that's one of the reasons why, in a fury of xenophobia, Congress slammed the door in 1924. So in some ways, history does repeat itself. But you know, the never-ending assertion that we don't have to be less than we are in order to be members in full standing of this society is something that gets reiterated in every generation of American immigration. Just recently, an immigrant took the oath of office to become the mayor of America's largest city. And, you know, Zoran Mamdani made some people crazy and wet their pants over the idea that he took the oath of office on a Quran. But in addition to his own grandfather's Quran, the other Quran was from the collection of Arturo Schomburg. And who's Arturo Schomburg? Arturo Schomburg is a Black Puerto Rican who, when he was growing up on the island, was told by a teacher that Black people had no history and had no accomplishments that needed to be taught or remembered. He came as a young scholar to the United States and became, along with James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the pillars of Black historical scholarship in the United States. And today, the Schomburg Library in Harlem is one of the greatest collections of African American history in the United States, founded by a Puerto Rican with a fabulous mustache. Now, Arturo Schomburg is someone who is not known and not remembered by most people in our country, but he really synthesizes the American story, prevailing over the racial barriers of the day, becoming greater than just another Puerto Rican migrant to New York at a time when people were moving from the island to New York, and really accomplishing something of great durability and great significance. And then you have this 34-year-old Ugandan-born mayor taking the oath of office on Arturo Schomburg's Quran. That's America. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Thank you. And now, Anneshia Hardy, thank you so much for giving us your last thoughts.
Yeah, so the hard truth is this, that progress in this country has never been automatic. Every expansion of freedom that we point to today exists because people force the country to move, often against its will. And so when we stop pushing, the nation doesn't stand still. It slides backwards towards the, racial hierarchy, towards the exclusion, towards the violence that it was founded on. And that's the pattern. So, oppression doesn't require, imagination. It maintains itself. And so when we see the resurgence of white nationalism, anti-immigrant policies, anti-Blackness, censorship, state violence, that's not history repeating itself by accident. That is what happens when the work of building a more humane society slows, while the work of preserving this type of dominance or authoritarian, environment never slows down. And so if we want to move towards progress as a country, one that, move towards a country that actually embraces all cultures, all histories and people, collaboration isn't optional. It's going to require a sustained effort across movements, across generation, across communities, and not just during moments of outrage or symbolic unity. And so, this country it's not going to turn the corner on its own. History has shown us, it only moves when enough people decide that maintaining humanity is worth more, work than maintaining power. And so I'll stop there. And I did want to say, I saw a question in the chat about Black immigrants. I would love to chat more about that.
That would be wonderful.
So yes, please reach out.
Thank you. We will.
I wrote a chapter about it in my book.
I was just going to say, yeah, I definitely want to talk about that. I have a whole lot to say about the flattening of Black immigrants in our space.
So thank you so much to all of you and to our 78 attendees who held on for 8 minutes after the hour and more. We really enjoyed this conversation, a great learning opportunity for us, and we're so honored to have the 4 speakers we had today. Our conference, unfortunately, has to close, but the